Why are prices higher during war in Ukraine, but not during war in Afghanistan? Most of the inflation is caused by supply chains disruption due to COVID. Not the war. But the reason it's having an impact at all is because Russia is the number 2 oil exporter in the world. And Ukraine is the number 2 grain exporter in the world. And those are both pretty vital parts of the world economy. They don't grow food in Afghanistan. Russia and Ukraine are, literally, 1,000 times more important to the global economy than Afghanistan. And Afghanistan was and is more isolated when not at war, since it is controlled by the Taliban. Russia historically has been a large exporter of agricultural products and oil products, two goods which the world economy has heavily depended on. 1. The inflation started before the war. Lockdowns and similar measures reduced the amount of goods and services produced. At the same time, the governments handed out money to prevent the now jobless part of the population from starving. As a result, there is now more money but fewer goods to buy with them. 2. The war doesn't cause inflation directly. The real issue is the ever-increasing amount of economic sanctions between Russia and the West. The problem isn't so much that Ukraine stopped exporting food, but that Russia stopped exporting fertilizer and that the EU can't produce fertilizer without cheap energy. But they no longer have cheap energy without Russian gas. The countries involved, Russia and Ukraine, are major exporters. Even if you don't buy petroleum products from Russia, there aren't any other worlds to buy from. The places you would buy petroleum from, even your own producers in a free market, are going to increase prices and sell to those customers that Russia can't reach. Similarly, even if you don't buy grain from Ukraine, the nations that do normally buy grain there are going to make offers to the countries you do buy from. That is going to affect prices and supplies for you and everyone else. We have a global market. Everything we produce, everything we buy can be bought and sold to anyone in the world. The transportation modes and supply chain to get goods to the destination is also important. Here again, wars can affect that. Ukraine and Russia are key players in some major commodities, and affect some major shipping, trade points. Afghanistan? Not so much unless you consider heroin poppies. Afghanistan produce little other than heroin and refugees. We had a direct pipeline bringing Russian gas to Europe, and need a lot of it, especially after Germany decided to close down their nuclear power plants. Because Russia was a key exporter, Afghanistan wasn't. Because Afghanistan manufacturing nothing and of course exporting nothing, but Russia exporting natural gas to EU. Ukraine exporting food such as wheat, fruit, vegetable, etc. to EU. Production becomes more difficult and expensive due to the war, and so does shipping. In summary, this is the main reason. Because the war in the Ukraine didn't cause inflation. A combination of COVID shutdowns and rampant money printing and negative real interest rates caused inflation. Putin is the scapegoat to prevent the government from accepting responsibility. Inflation is simply the devaluation of your currency. The US simply prints money out of thin air. Of course, our money is worth less when unlimited amounts are added to the supply out of thin air. During Afghanistan we did this, but not nearly at the same rate we are now. Because of the sanctions against Russia, many countries have stopped business with Russia, so they have less materials to deal with. This changes prices because of the law of supply and demand. Google your country's money supply during the past 3 years. While you're at it, do the same for the US, whose dollar is the reserve currency. Sprinkle some corporate profiteering on top of that and you're 80% there. When you shut down for 2 years due to COVID, the supply bound to run out eventually. Supply demand. During Afghan war, the world economy is still running versus stand still for 2 years prior to Russian-Ukraine war. Other than heroin, no one buys anything produced in Afghanistan. Ukraine, on the other hand, produces about a quarter of the world's wheat and corn. Any answer that doesn't acknowledge the 4x increase in worldwide monetary supply over the last 2 years is nonsense. You cannot quadruple the supply of something without reducing its value. There are a ton of things that can cause inflation, and a lot of those things tend to be happening at the same time right now. The Ukraine war has something to do with it, but doesn't explain all of the inflation. One reason that inflation happens is there is more demand than there is supply. The war would affect this, and when there is less supply than there is demand, the price of the supply will increase. Another reason would be rising wages. Businesses during and after COVID are paying their employees a lot more to get them on board. I see now hiring signs everywhere now offering way more than they did pre-COVID because so many places are short-staffed. The more you pay your employees, the higher your prices will be. Another reason is increased money supply. When money supply increases faster than the rate of production, that will cause inflation. Between the thousands of dollars that the government handed out for free, or the pause on the student loans or any other kind of relief that was provided during COVID, this will cause inflation. Not that I'm really against any of those things, but they do have an impact. The government spent trillions during COVID, and it will always make inflation worse. Cost of materials going up also causes a ton of inflation. Obviously, the more a business has to pay for materials like lumber, for example, those costs are going to be passed down to the consumers. So there is a lot that goes into it, and the pandemic drove a lot of this obviously. It just happened to coincide with a war. Politicians will try to blame the other party, but at the end of the day they both knew this was coming. It was impossible to avoid completely. Were heroin prices higher during Afghan war? Also, COVID maybe. Depends on which prices you are referring to and where you live. 9/11 heavily disrupted the economy. I was in high school and many of my friends had parents that lost their jobs. Russia supplies fuel and raw materials to much of Europe, most of which have sanctioned Russia. Afghanistan, on the other hand, has a virtually non-existent economy. They have a per capita GDP of $500. About 1/80th of the US. Their only import is opium, which is controlled by whatever terrorist group is in power at the time. Currently the Taliban.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Aircast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.